Hello, everyone. My name is Maureen Folk, and I'm the Curator of Collections here at the Chapman Museum. This talk is going to be about Seneca Ray Stoddard. You've probably heard his name if you've ever visited us at the Chapman Museum before, but if you haven't, the reason we're talking about Seneca Ray Stoddard is because he was a prolific photographer during the mid to late 1800s and up until his death in 1917. He captured images that shape our understanding of the time period in this region, and we have a large historical record supplemented by photographs because of him. I'm going to begin with some background information about him and his life, and then discuss his career and the lasting impact of his work in the Adirondacks. To begin, Stoddard was born in Wilton, New York in 1843 or 1844 to parents Charles and Julia Ray Stoddard, who were farmers. He was often called Ray by his family, but more commonly he was known as SR. He was named Seneca Ray after his mother's older brother, who was named for the Roman philosopher Seneca. Many people wonder if his name is derived from the indigenous Haudenosaunee group Seneca, but it was the Roman Seneca. When he was less than 10 years old in 1852, his mother passed away, and this certainly impacted the next several years of his life. By 1858, his father, Charles Stoddard, remarried, and the family moved north to Burke in Franklin County, which is close to the Canadian border. When they made this move, Stoddard was about 16 years old, and it was in Burke where he met someone who encouraged him to pursue his art. By 1862, Charles relocated the family again back south to Troy, and this is when Stoddard went to work at the Gilbert Car Company. They were a railroad car building company based out of Troy. He was hired by them as an ornamental painter of landscape scenes on railway car interiors and worked for them for about 3 years. This was Stoddard's launch into the first phase of his career. He learned a lot about printing, layout and design, and printing technology. Stoddard was described as bright, gregarious, ambitious, extremely self-motivated, and well-organized. But as talented as he was, the ornamental painting business wasn't providing enough money for him to help support his family. By about 1865, at the age of 20, Stoddard moved to Glens Falls and lived with the Potter family on Elm Street. This photo of Glen Street is one of Stoddard's earliest photographs of the city. You can see the caption at the bottom says, "Stores on Glen Street still standing." And this is because Glens Falls experienced a citywide fire in 1864, just 1 year earlier, and Stoddard arrived during a rebuilding phase. Glens Falls was a thriving city at the time of Stoddard's arrival. The mid-1800s were the height of the canal era, with more than 85 canal boats employed by companies along the feeder canal. These boats were regularly transporting 120 to 150 tons of cargo to Albany or New York City. Glens Falls was home to approximately 6,000 residents at this time, and the primary goods shipped down the canal were lumber, lime, and paper. These were the industries that were really thriving along the feeder canal and Hudson River at this time. This era launched Glens Falls into being one of the most prosperous towns in the state in the late 1800s. So Stoddard arrived at a pretty good time, and after he got his footing in this area, he opened up his own business for sign and ornamental painting. He had experience with charcoal, graphite pencil, and oil paint. Just a few years later, in 1868, he would marry the potter's daughter, Helena Augusta, also known as Gussie. They had 2 children, Leroy and Charles Stoddard. Leroy would go on to become a doctor specializing in plastic surgery, and Charles would become a lawyer. Neither of them had children, so Stoddard has no living direct descendants. They settled down next to Gussie's parents on Elm Street, and they ran their business from home. By basing his business in Glens Falls at this time, Stoddard was setting himself up for financial and social success. He viewed Glens Falls as a gateway to the Adirondacks that had great potential for exploration. Stoddard was a smart businessman, and he sought out connections early on to individuals and organizations that he knew would propel his social mobility. And he cultivated those relationships so that he could offer them his services as a photographer. His networking led to many different opportunities, and these provided him with some income and increased his exposure. One of Stoddard's first clients at his house, sign, banner, and ornamental painting business was local photographer George Conkey, who had a studio downtown. Conkey was largely focused on portrait photography, which was the most popular format at this time, and he had his studio set up with various backgrounds for people to pose in front of. He initially hired Stoddard to paint a banner in his studio for one of these backdrops, but then took him under his wing once he recognized that he had potential. Stoddard began apprenticing under Conkey, and he focused initially on stereo view photography. Conkey is the one who introduced Stoddard to both photography and stereography. Stereo cards were a great way for people to experience the Adirondacks without visiting, but it encouraged more and more tourism as well. They were oriented as two nearly identical photos next to each other, and if they were viewed through a stereoscope, the image appeared almost as 3D. Stoddard latched onto this technique quickly, but he also wanted a bigger challenge. Through his networking, he connected with the Delaware and Hudson Railroad Company and the Adirondack Railway, which was built and operated by Thomas Durant and William West Durant. For those unfamiliar with his work, William West Durant would go on to develop the Great Camp architectural style across the Adirondacks, including his design of Great Camp Sagamore. Through this opportunity, Stoddard photographed the railroad as it was actively being built across the Adirondacks. So Stoddard really latched onto photography quickly and honed his skills to make him a competitive photographer in the area. From the beginning of his career, he used wet plate negatives. He would take a piece of glass and coat it in a wet emulsion. He would need to capture the photo while the plate was still coated, and then develop the negative in a portable darkroom in the field. Once he had it adhered to the plate, he then had to safely transport the plates back to his studio and develop the photographs. Back home, most of Stoddard's photographs were printed on albumin paper. It was paper coated in egg whites and then floated in a silver nitrate solution. Printing photographs from negatives was done using diffused sunlight, so no chemical developer would have been used. You can see the setup Stoddard had at his home was fairly ideal for developing photographs. As you can see, the sheets hanging from the windows help to diffuse the sunlight and develop the photos. After they're developed to the desired exposure, a bath of sodium thiosulfate fixes the print as it is and prevents further darkening. The print was then toned with a gold solution to stabilize the silver from earlier in the process. This entire process, along with just the matter of aging of albumin prints, leads to the visual effect that we call sepia toned today. Stoddard had a broad range of coloring on his albumin prints, and that demonstrates that Stoddard experimented with different commercially available papers and different toning solutions. He didn't always like the results, and sometimes he would X out a portion of the final image, which we can see in some of the photographs in our collection today, marked by red X's. So obviously, at this point in time, photography was a really involved process, but Stoddard honed this craft to the point where he was maneuvering a portable darkroom across the Adirondack Mountains, and he was still able to develop stunning photographs. Luckily, advancements in photo development would make this a much easier process, and since Stoddard was keen on keeping up with technological advancements, he didn't have to use this process for the length of his entire career. By 1870, his varied work experience had built his confidence in his work, and he began publishing guidebooks, an endeavor that combined his expertise in art, printing, writing, and illustration. Gussie was critically helpful in the development of Stoddard's home print business. She cared for the family, the home, and the business simultaneously. They began selling photographs out of their home by mail order. This rapidly grew, and he had agents selling his prints in New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, Montreal, London, Paris, and Berlin. He labeled his prints with numbers and titles to make it easier to make sales, but he often left off dates. He advertised them in newspapers and guides, and this was really his launch into mainstream recognition for his photography. Stoddard also created a logo for his growing business, as you can see here on the bottom right corner. He can be seen riding a camera tripod and nearly spearing a money bag with his quill. In 1876, he was recognized on a national scale when his photographs were exhibited at the Philadelphia Centennial International Exhibition. This was the first official World's Fair to be held in the United States. It was held in Philadelphia from May 10th to November 10th, 1876, to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Nearly 10 million people attended this exposition, so it was a great opportunity for exposure for Stoddard. As his business expanded, he experimented with different things. He would alter photographs that had cloudless skies by burning in clouds from other negatives to enhance the image. He would alter negatives with ink or oil paint to enhance different elements. He painted flames in nighttime campfire scenes. He added color to some of his more popular prints, and he hand-colored glass slides. He began to author guidebooks, magazines, journal essays, and newspaper articles. He was also a skilled speaker and traveled with lantern slides that he produced from his photographs. He would give lectures across the state discussing the changing environment, industry, or other topics that aligned with his photographs. He quickly picked up cartography as well and created Adirondack maps spanning the periods of horsepower, rail travel, and the advent of the automobile. His cartography really complemented his photography, and he could tie both of these passions together. His first guidebook was published in 1873. He wrote Lake George Illustrated, which contained some early rudimentary maps. But his publication just 1 year later in 1874 showcased a more sophisticated map of the Adirondack wilderness, and the map continued to evolve from 1874 to 1880. One of the things that shaped Stoddard's photography was his ever-evolving religious beliefs. He experienced periods of devout faith and periods of rejecting organized religion. He joined the Masons early on after his arrival in Glens Falls, and he aligned himself with the temperance movement. He found that through these organizations, he was surrounded by like-minded individuals who were also interested in spiritualism and beliefs beyond conventional religious views. He grew to realize that his beliefs fell more in line with Ralph Waldo Emerson, as he considered nature sublime. This pushed Stoddard to eventually leave organized religion altogether, and he focused more on the presence that he found in nature. While he probably didn't consider himself a religious man at the end of his life, he certainly would have been considered spiritual. Stoddard had built up quite the portfolio, and by 1878, when he was hired as the director of the photography division of the New York State Surveying Team, where he worked with Verplanck Colvin, and he went on to document the devastation of the lumber industry, swaths of tree stumps, charcoal ovens, flooded landscapes, and log jams. Stoddard became deeply concerned about the future of the Adirondacks through his work as a photographer. He was witnessing firsthand the impact that people and industry had across the landscape. In the same year, he published his first photography book titled The Adirondacks. He would go on to publish 22 additional photography books. By 1880, Stoddard had recorded enough mapping data to produce a unified map of the Adirondack region. He introduced the map in his 1880 guidebook, and New York State would adopt it as an official map. He consistently updated this map and produced new editions of it. One of the ways Stoddard was able to expand his portfolio was through travel. With the help of a number of different people, Stoddard traversed the Adirondacks and beyond, capturing remote locations that had not been seen by the public. For one of his first big trips, he traversed more than 300 miles across the Adirondacks, accompanied by his brother-in-law, Charles O'Bleness. He did this so he could put together his book, Adirondacks Illustrated. His guidebooks covered all sorts of topics, from what to wear for a hike to the pesky nature of black flies. Stoddard describes in detail the different towns and villages scattered across the Adirondacks. He lists places to stay, mountains to climb, and routes to get you there. He discusses personal interactions that he's had with various individuals and cites historical events that have shaped the area. Accompanied by his sketches, Stoddard provided a cohesive guide for the Adirondacks well before they were mainstream. O'Blennis also assisted with part of a longer trip. Stoddard decided to sail a custom-made canoe from Glens Falls to New York City and then up the Atlantic coast to the Bay of Fundy in Nova Scotia. For this 2,000-mile trip, he was also accompanied by R.B. Burchard, who was the secretary of the American Canoe Association. He used these trips to expand on his knowledge of the state and the world. He wanted to show that there were different places, people, and opportunities all around them. Stoddard continued to keep up with the photography industry as it evolved at this time. He experimented with different lenses and tested different supplies or printing techniques. He switched from wet plates to gelatin dry plate negatives when they became available in the 1880s. These simplified his process. He no longer needed to coat the plate in the field before taking a photograph. He also stayed in tune with George Eastman's inventions and saw that photography was growing in popularity. He even featured an ad for a Kodak camera in his 1889 edition of the Adirondacks Illustrated. In that same year, Kodak released special film for the Alvista panoramic camera that Stoddard owned. This allowed him to take wide-angle landscape photographs he couldn't capture with his fixed-lens camera before. These improvements in photography were happening quickly, but because Stoddard insisted on keeping up with it, it made him more flexible, and he was able to produce better photographs. It would be impossible to claim which period of time was Stoddard's best, but from the 1870s to the early 1880s, he captured some of his most stunning photographs, including many Lake George scenes. While he's best known for his scenic photographs, he curated scenes of different groups or individuals, still primarily in outdoor settings. Stoddard had an understanding of photo composition that really made for unique and stunning photographs. I want to take a moment just to talk about his photographs of Lake George. Stoddard took more than 900 photographs of Lake George. These included mountain scenes, sunrises, steamboats, hotels, family homes, or group outings. When he arrived in Glens Falls, Lake George was already a tourist destination, and Stoddard noted that most of the tourists were visiting from New York City. He would include in his guidebooks that tourists could board the train, and Manhattan's northernmost connection would take them to Glens Falls. From there, they could board stagecoaches and ride up to the village of Lake George. The stagecoaches followed the military road that was established during the French and Indian War, a road that we now call Route 9. By featuring Lake George so prominently in his work, Stoddard certainly played a role in the growth of regional tourism, an industry that heavily supports the local economy to this day. In 1889, Stoddard traveled to New York City and captured two of his most famous photos. He took a photograph of the Washington Square Arch and the Statue of Liberty. What made these unique is that he took both of these photographs at night. Flash bulbs for photography wouldn't be invented until the 1930s. Stoddard was using magnesium powder and potassium chlorate to essentially cause a small explosion to create light. He did this each and every time he wanted to take a nighttime photo, and he had to time it exactly right. It was a dangerous technique, and Stoddard was actually sent to the hospital after he took the photo of the Washington Square Arch, but he didn't go until he confirmed that he had gotten the photograph. Magnesium powder flashes were a widely used technique at this time, but Stoddard's understanding and application of it made him a pioneer in nighttime photography. He applied this flash technique to illuminate nighttime shots across the Adirondacks, including depictions of camp life and the first nighttime photograph he took at Howe Caverns. Between 1892 and 1900, Stoddard took many lengthy trips. He was looking to generate income through illustrated lectures, so he traveled and presented lantern slides of some of the exotic locations that he had visited. On February 25th, 1892, Stoddard would have arguably one of the most impactful lectures of his life. He gave a lecture accompanied by lantern slides at the New York State Assembly. He presented images of the Adirondacks and showed the impact of industry on the natural wilderness. He highlighted destruction from the logging and mining interests that clear-cut mountains, caused flooding, and led to the loss of treasured wilderness. On May 20th, 1892, just 2 months later, New York State designated the Adirondack Park, and Governor Roswell Flowers signed off on it. Those that fought for the Adirondack Park credit him with swaying the legislature to create the park within such a quick turnaround of his presentation. So we can see a genuine, lasting impact as a result of his photography. In July of 1892, Stoddard began a journey up to Alaska. He was looking for content for a new lecture and wanted to embark on a unique trip. He traveled by train and boat primarily and made several stops along the way. On the last leg of his journey, they traversed the Inside Passage, and it was recorded that the waves in the Pacific Ocean led many of the 60 passengers on board to pass on their meal times. Stoddard was one of only 4 passengers that didn't miss a single meal the entire trip. As he set his sights on Alaska, he was in awe. He took photographs of the scenery, the bustling salmon industry, and the indigenous cultures that were so unfamiliar to him. Stoddard traveled further to Sitka and experienced a Russian settlement that had many traces of the past remaining. He visited a Greco-Russian Orthodox church, which housed foreign treasures, including a supposed lost Raphael Madonna. One of his only disappointments of this trip was the failure of his elephant camera. This piece of equipment had been built under Stoddard's supervision, specifically for the Alaska scenery, and Stoddard was looking forward to taking negatives that were measuring 20 by 49.5 inches. It was reported to be the largest camera in the world at the time. Luckily, Stoddard had 2 other cameras with him, so he was able to work with his Kodak and one other camera that was intended for making lantern slides. After his return to Glens Falls, he showcased his trip at the Glens Falls Opera House on Warren Street to an audience of more than 1,000 people. On September 21st, 1894, Stoddard embarked on a 10,000-mile tour of the continent. He went from Niagara Falls to Chicago, the Badlands of the Dakotas, Yellowstone National Park, which was established in 1872, Salt Lake City, Colorado, the Grand Canyon, and to the Pacific Coast. By the end of his cross-continental trip, Stoddard had taken more than 700 negatives. By March 25th of the following year, he put together illustrated lectures titled America's Wonderland and Across the Continent. For his Glens Falls audience, these lectures were a revelation. According to the Glens Falls Morning Star newspaper, it was a wonderful and educational evening, and Stoddard's narration of his explorations was captivating. But this seems to be where Stoddard's prominence begins to fade. The advent of the Kodak box camera placed cameras in the hands of everyday people. This began to render his commercial photography business obsolete. And Stoddard would even become a dealer for Eastman Kodak to keep up with the rapidly evolving camera industry. I think Stoddard was probably excited to see photography grow, despite the fact that it directly impacted his business. As someone who always kept up with the advancements in technology, he would have seen this as a huge step forward. In 1906, Stoddard lost his wife, Gussie. She had been an integral part of their successful business, and this surely impacted him. But just 2 years later, Stoddard remarried their longtime housekeeper, Emily Doty, in 1908. By 1915, Stoddard's health was declining, and Emily became his caretaker. He ceased almost all of his artistic and commercial activities. He would pass 2 years later on April 26, 1917, just a few weeks shy of his birthday. Stoddard and Emily are buried in Pineview Cemetery in Queensbury, while his first wife, Gussie, and their 2 sons are buried in Bay Street Cemetery in Glens Falls. While Stoddard was well known and well respected at the height of his career, he was largely forgotten as a photographer until the 1940s. This was in part due to the public adoption of the Kodak camera and his business waning over the last 2 decades of his life. People became infatuated with taking photographs, and this is a trend that we continue to see today, even as technology has changed. Once he passed, people didn't view his work as being groundbreaking or ahead of its time. It would take a few more decades before the appreciation for his photography made a comeback. He was rediscovered as art historians named him along other significant 19th century photographers like William H. Jackson and Matthew Brady. It's an interesting anecdote that all of these revered photographers were born within sight of the Adirondacks. Stoddard in Wilton, Jackson in Peru, and Brady near Lake George. By the 1950s, museums began to collect his works. His photographs were and are regarded as historical records of past places and times. By 1980, his photographs were prominently included in the National Gallery of Art's exhibition, American Light, the Luminist Movement. In a 1949 issue of The Conservationist, Stoddard was given high praise. The article noted, "By recording so faithfully and with such feeling the beauty of the North Woods, Stoddard provided a powerful argument for both their protection and their enjoyment. He was a conservationist." These are a few photos from inside Stoddard's home. This would have been his primary workspace because, like I said, he ran his entire business from his home. Here at the Chapman, we're thankful to have a large collection of his photographs, as well as paintings, guidebooks, maps, and business records. The Stoddard collection came to the museum by chance in 1977. Teacher and author Maitland DeSormo had purchased the collection from Stoddard's family in the early 1960s, including photographs, negatives, paintings, sketches, publications, business records, and memorabilia. The collection was primarily sold between the Chapman Museum and the Adirondack Experience in Blue Mountain Lake. Our collection at the Chapman numbers over 4,500 items and over 900 photographs of Lake George alone. There's a book that was put together by Joseph Cutchell King and Tim Widener, both former directors of the Chapman. The book is Water and Light and features photographs of Lake George. The earliest photograph featured in the book was taken in 1868. It details his life and accomplishments and features some of the most beautiful pictures of Lake George. Stoddard is credited with helping to create and promote the tourist trade in the Adirondacks. He created the ideas and images of the Adirondacks that continue to persist today. Stoddard's artistic hunger took him through the American West, Alaska, American South, into the Caribbean, Europe, Russia, and the Middle East. He took more than 10,000 photographs of the Adirondacks and created a historical record of this region that continues to teach us about the past. Stoddard was a luminist photographer who was part of a larger photography movement happening across the world. He latched onto this career and used it to create a flourishing business as a writer, cartographer, painter, and photographer. He was a visual historian, forever shaping our knowledge of the time period and leaving behind a legacy of maps, books, and photographs. I think Stoddard would be happy to know that he was remembered for accomplishing so many things, but I think one of his most profound and lasting impacts was his advocacy for conservation. His passion for preserving the Adirondacks is a large reason why we still have the beautiful landscape that we do today. We owe our appreciation of unspoiled views to his passion, his determination, and his camera lens.